This is a tribute to you. This is from our hometown newspaper. And it talks about Irma, and it talks about how it was a completely weird and crazy thing that happened with Irma. How the slightest shift kept Hurricane Irma from turning into an even worse disaster. Nathaniel Lash and Neil Betty from the St. Petersburg Times. Now, as you watch this, you're going to be blown away by what happened. So as we go through this, Hurricane Irma approached Florida as a terrifying storm. By some measures, it was the strongest ever to leave the Atlantic Ocean. It flattened Caribbean islands, devastated the Florida Keys, and caused the largest evacuation in Florida's history. But when Irma hit the Florida mainland, it immediately weakened. It immediately weakened and threaded the needle between the state's major cities. It did far less damage than feared. Listen to that again, folks. It immediately weakened. It threaded the needle between the state's major cities. It did far less damage than feared. There you go. Watch as that storm threads the needle and dissipates as if by some sort of magic. With hundreds of lives and billions in property on the line, the way atmospheric forces nudged the storm just a few miles made all the difference. Just what were those atmospheric forces? Are forecasters able to nail down what those forces were? Irma was led towards the Gulf of Mexico by a massive high-pressure zone over the Atlantic Ocean called the Bermuda High, which year after year shuffles hurricanes west along its southern edge. There's the Bermuda High. Meanwhile, a mass of dry, low-pressure air, what meteorologists call a trough, was slowly creeping from the Midwest towards the Gulf of Mexico. Forecasters knew the trough would eventually collide with the western edge of the Bermuda High, battering it until it was too weak to steer the storm. As soon as that happened, the storm would turn north. When would that happen was the question all along. But forecasters did not know when the trough's winds would arrive, and when Irma turned would determine where it hit Florida. Some early forecasts showed the trough would turn Irma while it was north of Cuba, driving it up Florida's spine. This would have been a worst-case scenario. For low-lying points south of Miami and its beaches, the forecasters warned that disastrous storm surge was possible. Red areas had a chance of facing more than 9 feet of water. But the trough was too slow. Irma kept moving west, and South Florida was largely spared. What was it that kept the trough from being too fast? What was it that kept Irma moving west? What was it that largely spared South Florida? Instead, the storm hit Cuba. Irma went only a few miles inland and still killed 10 people. The brief landfall tore up the storm's backside, weakening it. That left the storm heading straight for Florida's west coast. Irma's path still depended upon the strength of the trough. The dry air had the potential to strengthen Irma's path and aim its storm surge towards the Everglades. But it also might be too weak, in which case Irma would shrug it off and continue northwest along the coast. Over 4 million people live near the 100 miles of coast from Everglades City to the edge of the Florida Panhandle. For each West Coast city, the worst case scenario was for Irma to come up alongside it, pushing a massive storm surge into the densely populated coastal neighborhoods. One forecast showed it hitting Naples or Cape Coral, which is just west of Fort Myers. A direct hit would have inundated both with seawater. Multiple coastal downtowns would have been submerged. Naples, Bonita Springs, Cape Coral. When Floridians awoke Sunday morning, they saw forecasts signaling the storm maintaining its strength over warm water, then grazing Pinellas County as it passed. Irma would have hit Tampa Bay as a Category 3 hurricane, with wind gusts up to 120 miles per hour. Large parts of St. Petersburg and Tampa would have been underwater, so would all of the Pinellas beaches. This is where your friendly neighborhood Christian whistleblower is. All of this would have been underwater. As Irma approached the coast, the trough's dry air began getting sucked into Irma's vortex, but the exact effect that would have on the storm was hard to pin down. The landfall was determined by that very subtle interaction, and it's very hard to forecast. It's almost as if some unseen hand was at work. Said Derek Herndon, a hurricane researcher at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. We simply don't have the ability to nail down a forecast within 50 miles. Ultimately, the trough was able to straighten Irma's path. The storm made landfall on Marco Island, 10 miles south of Naples. Though the storm was barreling north, the miles it traveled west were all that matters. It hit 6 miles east of the city of Naples, 13 miles east of Fort Myers, and 50 miles east of the city of Tampa. One final interaction between Irma and the trough kept the hurricane away from Florida's big cities. One final interaction between Irma and the trough kept the hurricane away from Florida's big cities. As Irma absorbed it, the trough's momentum caused the storm to wobble. That pushed the storm far enough west to miss Orlando, but not so far that it would hit Tampa Bay or go back out to sea where it could regain strength. And poof, it's gone. It could have been 30, 40 miles west, and it wouldn't have weakened as fast. A lot of things went Florida's way at the last minute, said Phil Klotzbach, meteorologist at Colorado State University. It could have been a lot more people that had the same problems as the Keys. In the end, it wasn't Tampa Bay's unique geography or position along the coast that saved it. The difference between Irma's final track and a direct hit on Tampa Bay was the storm turning just a few miles sooner. What mysterious forces were at work that caused these delicate interactions that really defy explanation? Could it have been the directed, energetic intention of the Gospel Truth Army? Could it have been the directed intention of George Noory's Coast to Coast AM audience? Could it have been the Gospel Truth Army making the change they wanted to see? Could it have been the Gospel Truth Army staying fearless, my friends, and doing what we're here to do? Gospel Truth Army, I salute you. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower. This has been the Gospel Truth about what happened with Hurricane Irma. Now you know the rest of the story. Kudos to George Noory, kudos to Coast AM, and kudos to you, the Gospel Truth Army. Stay fearless, my friends.